Why have African people, throughout the course of history, so often been viewed as a threat? It's a question that cuts deep into the core of global history, one that's rarely explored with the nuance and honesty it deserves. Let me make one thing clear before we begin. This video isn't about fueling conflict or making any group feel diminished. My intention isn't to divide, but to confront uncomfortable historical truths and understand why Africans and their descendants have been perceived this way. This is my personal reflection. While none of us can truly grasp the mindset of those who crafted these perceptions, I aim to shed light on recurring patterns, ask difficult questions, and examine how these old narratives still shape the realities of Afro-ascended people today. This isn't a plea for sympathy or validation. It's an invitation to understand how the past continues to mold our present. So, settle in, because this is African Untold Myth Unveiled. Before we dive deeper, I have a quick question for you. I know many of you are watching from all corners of the world, connected by a shared passion for African mythology. I'd love to reconnect. Drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from. I'll be joining the conversation in the comments. And if you're enjoying the content, your like and subscription truly help more than you know. Now, back to the story. It's often said that truth carries power, and for some, that power can be terrifying. From the dawn of recorded time, Africa was never merely a continent. It was a cradle, the birthplace, the beginning, the soil where humanity first drew breath. But what happens when the world realizes that the very people it has long tried to diminish are, in fact, its source? That's where the fear begins. Long before the ships arrived, before the chains were forged, and before the falsehoods found their way into textbooks, Africa stood not just as a continent, but as a radiant beacon. The Nubians, the Kushites, the people of Keth, builders of cities, keepers of time, masters of medicine and the stars. Their wisdom wasn't some legend whispered through generations. It was carved into stone, measured in monuments that still rise against the sky, enduring erosion and denial alike. And that frightened the world, because when the first humans were black, when the earliest civilizations were African, when the sciences of numbers, healing, and thought that shaped humanity were born under the African sun, the entire world was forced to face an unsettling truth. Placing Africa at the center of history doesn't just add a chapter, it rewrites the entire story of superiority. It means that those who later claimed to discover the world arrived late. It means those once called primitive were actually the originators. And that reversal upends the balance of power. The notion that blackness isn't a footnote to history, but its foundation, threatens any system built on a hierarchy. Because if Africa is the beginning, if its people are the source, then controlling Africa was never merely about land or labor. It was about controlling the truth itself. Even the ancients recognized this. Herodotus, hailed as the father of history, described the Ethiopians as tall, wise, and skilled, more advanced in certain sciences than the Greeks. Arab chroniclers spoke in awe of Africa's rich and orderly empires. Chinese explorers recorded kingdoms filled with art, laws, and deep spirituality. But soon, admiration gave way to unease. The more the world saw, the more it feared what Africa represented. A strength that didn't stem from the West, and a legacy that couldn't be rewritten without force. And so, the narrative was altered. Africans were cast as savages, even as they held the blueprint of civilization. Their deities were dismissed as idols, their traditions branded superstition. Their achievements were buried, sometimes literally, beneath foreign soil and museum glass. Because to admit the truth of Africa's primacy would be to admit the world's death, and that truth for centuries has remained the greatest threat of all. Let's make one thing absolutely clear. This isn't only about the past.
It's about understanding why the very existence of African people still unsettled systems that weren't created for us, but instead built on top of us. The erasure of African brilliance didn't happen by accident. It was intentional, calculated, and strategic. The opening chapter of this story isn't one of victimhood. It's one of origin. And that origin isn't weak or fragmented. It's fierce, resilient, and deeply powerful. For centuries, that unyielding power that doesn't seek permission, has been the world's greatest fear.
There's a reason the black body has long been both idolized and oppressed, desired and demonized, admired and controlled. From the sugar plantations of the Caribbean to the cotton fields of the American South, the African physique wasn't just viewed as a source of labor. It was seen as a threat wrapped in rhythm, strength, and endurance. Let's talk about how the physical became political. Colonizers crafted a language of contradiction to describe Africans: strong yet simple, enduring yet thoughtless, powerful yet submissive. These weren't innocent observations, they were weapons of ideology. By amplifying physical strength while denying intellect, colonizers built a convenient excuse for exploitation. They are made for hard work, they said. They feel less pain. They can withstand more suffering. Those lies weren't random. They were part of a carefully designed global narrative, one meant to strip away humanity while maintaining fear of what Africans might become if ever truly free. Because truthfully, it wasn't weakness they feared, it was the possibility of African strength merging with self-determination. Think about history's patterns. In sports, in music, in military service, black athletes dominate the world stage, yet their victories are often shadowed by suspicion rather than celebration. Black soldiers fought and died for nations that refused them dignity. Black artists birthed the world's most transformative music, only to have their creations stolen or diluted. Even in triumph, African excellence is met with unease. Why? Because ungoverned greatness threatens any structure built on control. This fear of the black body is ancient. Roman chronicles spoke of Nubians as fearless warriors. Arab historians admired the stamina and discipline of East African merchants. European traders, even while dehumanizing Africans, couldn't stop writing about their unmatched strength and endurance. That awe eventually twisted into mythology, the myth of the superhuman African. It's the same myth that fuels stereotypes today, the idea that black people are naturally athletic. But beneath that so-called compliment lies something sinister. It strips away individuality, intellect, and emotion, reducing humanity to raw muscle. It's the reason why black men walking through certain neighborhoods are seen not as people, but as potential threats. It's why black women's bodies are both hypersexualized and invalidated, expected to be unbreakable, denied softness, denied help. Across the globe, the African body has been treated as both a prize and a danger, a site of power that others have sought to suppress.
Because when a people awaken to the full measure of their strength, physical, cultural, and spiritual, they become unstoppable. For centuries, systems were built to keep African power reactive rather than revolutionary. But that tide is turning. Across the diaspora and the continent, we are reclaiming our story, not only the history of who we were, but the reality of who we are. Because the body is more than flesh, it's culture, it's spirit, it's a political statement. And when that truth is understood, it becomes clear why the African body has never been seen as merely powerful. It is power itself. And power that cannot be controlled is what empires have always feared most. When we think of oppression, our minds often picture chains, whips, and guns. But some of the most devastating weapons ever used against African people were not forged from metal. They were crafted from ideas, erasure, revision, rebranding. Let's talk about how African knowledge itself became a battlefield, and why remembering became a radical act of resistance. Long before European ships reached African shores, the continent was home to flourishing centers of science, architecture, philosophy, astronomy, and medicine. From the precise geometry of the great Zimbabwe ruins to the Dogon people's intricate understanding of Sirius B, a star Western scientists wouldn't discover until the 20th century, Africans were decoding the universe long before colonizers could even chart it. Yet in most classrooms today, Africa's story only begins at the moment of slavery. Why? Because knowledge is power, and African knowledge directly threatened the logic of colonial domination. It dismantled the myth of an uncivilized continent. It shattered the illusion that black people had no history before bondage. So, they burned libraries, they outlawed languages, they silenced the griots, the storytellers, the memory keepers. They criminalized spiritual systems and stripped away secret names like Imhotep, an African polymath who lived a millennium before Hippocrates and was the true father of medicine. They diminished Timbuktu, a city once home to over 700,000 manuscripts on medicine, mathematics, law, and theology, written in Arabic, Ajami, and native African scripts. And they buried the truth that Kemet, ancient Egypt, was not a European marvel, but a black civilization that changed the world. Why go to such extremes? Because recognizing African intellectual authority would unravel the very foundation of white supremacy. You cannot claim superiority over a people whose ancestors pioneered surgery, algebra, metallurgy, irrigation, and cosmology, while your own were still struggling through winters in wooden huts. You cannot enslave a people whose worldview teaches that all things, land, spirit, body, and time, are interconnected and sacred. You cannot colonize a nation whose children know exactly who they are and where they come from. So, they made it illegal for enslaved Africans to read. They rewrote textbooks. They demonized African spirituality as witchcraft and dismissed African science as mere superstition. They ensured our stories were told by them, for them. But the stories never died. They lived, hidden in songs, encoded in symbols, carried in oral traditions, whispered from one generation to the next. Our knowledge was never lost. It was preserved in silence, waiting. And now that silence is breaking. You can see it in the rise of African-centered education, in the revival of ancestral healing and herbal medicine, in the scholars, creators, and visionaries of the diaspora who are reclaiming what was stolen. Because once you begin to grasp the depth of genius within Africa's legacy, you also begin to understand why it had to be silenced, and even more powerfully, what happens when that silence finally ends. There's a reason fear has shadowed African people wherever colonialism set its roots, not because they were fragile, but because they never accepted defeat. Across continents and centuries, African resistance has shaken empires to their core. Each time oppression tried to crush the African spirit, it rose again, louder, stronger, unbroken. Let's explore the deep-seated fear of African rebellion and why that fear has endured through history. When people hear rebellion, names like Natona, Ya Santewa, and Toussaint Louverture often come to mind. But what's rarely understood is just how vast and continuous African resistance was. On slave ships, captives leapt into the ocean rather than surrender their freedom. Across the Americas, revolts erupted from the coasts of Brazil to the plantations of Haiti. In Africa itself, kingdoms built fortresses, forged coded systems, trained warriors, and defended their territories with military precision that rivaled the world's greatest empires. The Zulu nation under Shaka Zulu revolutionized warfare in southern Africa. The kingdom of Dahomey raised an elite all-female army, the Agoji, whose courage and strategy terrified invaders. The maroon communities of Jamaica and Suriname escaped into remote lands, founding independent societies that colonial forces could never truly conquer.
But here's what history often omits. Resistance wasn't only waged with swords or spears. Africans fought back through spirit, culture, and intellect. They hid liberation messages in the rhythms of drums. They transformed Christian hymns into anthems of freedom. They braided maps and escape routes into the hair of their children. They disguised their deities within Catholic saints, turning oppression itself into a battlefield of belief. This spiritual resilience made Africans impossible to fully subdue. How do you enslave a people who believe their ancestors walk beside them? How do you dominate those who draw strength from pain and purpose from memory? You can shackle their bodies, but not their souls. You can burn their homes, but not their dreams. And that truth terrified colonizers, because white supremacy thrives on submission. African resistance revealed a dangerous truth to empire. Even in chains, one can still be free. That same fire continues to burn today. From the streets of Ferguson to the protests in Lagos, from Johannesburg to Baltimore, a shared rhythm and defiant energy echo through generations, a force that refuses to be silenced. What unsettles many institutions today is the fear that this awakening, this unyielding spirit, will spark others to rise, to question, to reclaim. That is why African resistance has so often been branded as dangerous, radical, or violent, because it speaks a truth that makes the powerful tremble. Freedom is never given, it is seized. And across the African world, people have always known how to take it. As we near the end of this exploration, we must ask, why does African identity still provoke fear in the 21st century? The colonizers may have departed, but their systems of exploitation and erasure remain. Yet today, Africa stands not merely as a continent rich in natural resources, but as a reservoir of limitless human potential, creative force, and revolutionary will. African identity is far more than geography. It's a living power, a collective energy that defies categorization and resists commodification. It challenges the world order simply by existing. And that is why, even now, the world continues to fear not Africa's weakness, but its unstoppable strength. A force that knows its history, its roots, and its destiny. That's what makes Africa's spirit so uncontainable. Let's explore why this enduring power continues to unsettle the world. First, we must look at the economic and cultural weight Africa still holds. Despite being home to the world's youngest population, immense natural wealth, and some of the fastest-growing economies on Earth, many African nations remain treated as extraction zones for global powers. Multinational corporations drain Nigeria's oil, mine Sierra Leone's diamonds, and hoard African art and artifacts in foreign museums. Control over Africa's wealth remains a central force in global politics. But a new Africa is rising, one that refuses to be stripped of its value. From Afrobeats electrifying the global music scene to Pan-African movements reshaping education and identity, African culture is emerging as a modern symbol of influence. Across the diaspora, people are redefining what it means to be African, and the world is taking notice. African literature, film, fashion, and technology are no longer fringe. They are leading the global stage. And that's precisely why Africa's authentic identity still poses a threat. It embodies a kind of freedom that powerful nations cannot control. It doesn't conform to Western ideals of uniformity or consumerism. It represents resilience, creativity, and self-determination. The more Africans celebrate their traditions, from speaking indigenous languages and wearing cultural attire to reconnecting with ancestral spirituality, the more they awaken a power that transcends borders and expectations. This liberation of identity terrifies systems built on domination because it threatens to unravel the unequal hierarchies that underpin global order.
The economic influence of African people, the power of the black dollar, is now undeniable. Entrepreneurs, thinkers, and creators from the continent and its diaspora are transforming industries and forcing the world to reimagine Africa's role. As African nations reclaim their voice, their wealth, and their space on their own terms, the global community will have no choice but to acknowledge the strength of African identity. The truth is simple. The more African identity flourishes, the more it challenges centuries-old narratives of supremacy and subjugation. From activism in the streets to economic movements in the marketplace, African identity, once labeled a threat, continues to rise, not to dominate, but to stand in its rightful place in the global dialogue. It's an identity rooted in inclusion, not exclusion, and it cannot be erased. As we've uncovered throughout this journey, the historical fear of Africans stems from intertwined forces of power, resistance, and perception. Whether it's Africa's legacy as the cradle of humanity, its enduring cultural brilliance, or the sheer resilience of its people, these factors have long shaped the world's view and its fears. But here's the truth. Africa's story has never been one of helplessness. It is a story of strength, rebirth, and a sacred connection to the land, to its people, and to tomorrow. The fear of Africa was never about its weakness. It was always about its power, a power that endures, evolves, and continues to echo across the world. The world cannot erase Africa's legacy, and as Africans reclaim their voice in the global story, they remind everyone that Africa's strength, wisdom, and beauty are not relics of the past. They are living forces shaping the present and the future. This isn't just history. It's a legacy in motion, vibrant, unstoppable, and eternal. And that brings us to the end of this journey, a journey through truth, power, and the enduring spirit of Africa. If this story resonated with you, remember, Africa's history isn't ancient dust. It's alive. It beats through our music, our art, our stories, and our people. Here at African Myths and Folklores, we're reclaiming that pulse, one story at a time. If you believe in amplifying African voices and rediscovering the wisdom our ancestors left behind, then this is your space. Drop a comment below and tell us what part of Africa's story moves you most. Have you uncovered a myth, a legend, or a forgotten tale from your community? Share it. We might feature it in an upcoming episode. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from the heart of the continent. Every click, every share, every comment helps us keep Africa's voice alive and powerful. Until next time, remember, the stories of Africa don't just tell who we were, they remind us who we still are. Stay proud, stay rooted, and keep the fire of our ancestors burning. This is African Myths and Folklores, where history breathes and legends live on.